Go.
Yes, so the topic today is I normally try to go with stuff that's already being on the Facebook page and different stuff like that. And so we've got over the last few weeks, we've had the tide of Orthodox, um, whatever you want to call it, advertisement, and all of that. So I was just going to go over a few things just in general, and then we can usually leads to wherever it leads, But I don't know. We got two different topics, I guess. One would be that just in general, orthodoxy. We have people that are part of the group for a long time that take it seriously. When I say orthodoxy, I mean the Eastern or Oriental Orthodox Church proper. The guy who got me into studying anything about church history and don't just believe what you were told was a Syriac. He was a metropolitan archbishop in the Syriac Orthodox Church. And so he had basically studied back, and he ended up on, hey, Oriental Orthodoxy is the proper church. Now, in my view, and I think probably in a lot of people's views in this forum right now, he didn't go back far enough, and so we have that. And then the second thing I would say is related to this last post that I don't know Jack Ashcroft that he did, and apparently he's not a part of an official Orthodox church, which I thought he was, but. I parodied his post, his blog, which he was upset about, and but he said I copyright infringed. But anyway, but the whole reason I did it, and I'll take it off if he really wants me to take it off. But the whole reason I did it was to just go line by line and show him that, hey, I can make the exact antithesis of an argument that you are making from Scripture. So that leads to the question of what is the standard by which we judge Scripture? Not to put a plug in for my new video that's up on Jackson's YouTube, but and how do we decide? And so basically, the question is, why is it, and is it proper, that some people use Paul as the litmus test for every other piece of Scripture that is said? Meaning, if Yeshua and Paul have a seeming disagreement, people go with Paul. If Yeshua and the Father have a seeming disagreement, they go with Paul. If Yeshua and Isaiah have a disagreement, they go with Paul. If Paul, I'm sorry, I'm messing that up. If Paul and Yeshua have a disagreement, they go with Paul. If Paul and the Father have a disagreement, they go with Paul. If Paul and Isaiah, if Paul and Peter, whoever, Paul is given preference over everyone else. And I, in that rebuttal to Jack, put in Luke 6:40, the servant is not greater than the master. The master is always the one in which, in my opinion, the litmus test should be done against. So does anybody have any thoughts on this or counter arguments to that? And that's not, and that's not to say there's a whole other book of worms there because it's saying, I'm not arguing against Paul in this particular video. I'm saying that you can't take something that's seemingly against everybody else and then just make that the standard, or can you and should we?
Well, I think that attributing the Christian religion to an author or inventor has something to do with this too. Obviously, Messiah and Paul were not Christians. They were Jews of one respect or the other. But who founded the faith? Did Yeshua found a new faith? I don't think so. Maybe, but I don't think so. Paul definitely did. He admits it over and over. He's the foundational director and creator of Christianity. even N.T. Wright, the great evangelical scholar, did a tremendous essay on Paul's authorship of Christianity. And it was an apology, but I have it up. I mean, it's worth reading or listening to. I recorded it. And here we have a Christian evangelical who's stating flat out that Paul was the author of Christianity. So if he is, and if Christians tacitly consider Paul as the author, which they do, whether they want to admit it or not, then he's going to take precedence. But if those same people are duplicitous, they can move over to the other fellow, Yahshua HaMashiach, and claim that, well, what this guy says is right because he's the author of Christianity. This is a problem with the canon, again, especially with the Marcionite canon, that really was the spark that sparked canonicity for the Christian faith of that time, which, yeah, is another one that's always added is Ignatius. And gee, did I forget what I was saying?
Canonicity.
Yeah, canonicity. All the more reason to take a look at that a little more closely, especially among those who agree with canonicity, and try to decide with that who's the actual founder of the faith. And I think if people would consider this seriously and look at all sides of it, they would have to admit, like N.T. Wright did, that Paul is the author. So if Paul is the author, tacitly or not, then where else do we look? And oftentimes also, it is said that if you leave Paul out of this mix, then you're off on the wrong track, because Paul is the canonized letters that are in the Bible that God breathed into the councils of the 4th century, and that you're a heretic because of that. So I don't know if that answers a question or makes a good answer or not, but certainly it depends on who you're looking at in your mind as the founder. Who is the final authority? Obviously, among believers today, the final authority is not Yahweh. It's some other guy. And this is really well demonstrated in, I think it's, is it 1 Corinthians chapter 1? Where, you go after Apollos, you go after Peter, you go after me, whoever baptized you. Paul himself is talking about the problem with this kind of thinking.
Right. And one of the issues too, I think, is the idea of inerrancy in the canon, and the fundamentalist approach that every single piece has to fit in, or else it's all blown up. And so there are plenty of people who take the problem of Paul and, go one of two ways. They blow him up completely and he's anathema and we're not going to use him and he's of the devil. And then you have the other completely opposite approach. No, you're reading Paul wrong, and what he said was this, but what he really meant was this, over and over again, which in my opinion is if I have to make it work, then it's not inerrant, right? If I've got to flip backwards aerobics, it's not inerrant. So, but many people do take that approach, and there are ministries out there right now that take the approach that, hey, you're not understanding Paul. He's talking about this. He's talking about that. He's talking about things that don't fit in your Western mind. And so when you look at him, you think he's speaking, and then you've got the third group, which says, no, like you said, he did away completely with everything. And since he has this special revelation, we need to follow him. which to me begs the question, then it could be anybody. It could be Joseph Smith. It could be Muhammad. Anybody could have this special revelation, and you have no way to verify that because anyway, so is there anybody in the camp between Jeremy, Louisette, Professor Smith, Norman, Allison, Ann, Sherry, Marcel, that take the approach and try to that love Paul and think that he was pro-Torah completely and try to kind of fundamentalistically, is that a word, fit him into the Torah paradigm completely?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Anybody else?
Not completely.
Not completely?
Yeah.
I
Some
agree.
things.
Not completely. Because he says himself, this is my gospel. Unless you conform yourself to my gospel, then you're cursed.
He does say that it's his gospel. He does say he did not receive it from any man. And he says he received it from the Lord in a vision. Actually, that is said of him in Acts. Let's make that clear. The author of Acts says that about him.
And I hope that's the case. But I don't want to base my whole idea of salvation and eschaton on his boasting, whether it's right or wrong.
So is there anybody in the group that is, completely anti-Paul? Like there's nothing, he didn't do anything good. He is possibly the Antichrist or spawn of the devil or something like that. Anyone?
I would like to know, I'm not that, but I would like to know if there are people who identify Simon Magus in the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles being Paul, because I've heard people say that and I just can't see it.
I agree. I can't see it either.
Me either.
I see it in this, not in the sense of the totality of Simon Magus at all, because obviously there's things that Simon is doing that would have been completely reprehensible to Paul. But are there certain doctrines that are put in the mouth of Simon that are Pauline completely in nature? I think there are. And so I think that's where you get this idea. The idea being that they couldn't come out against whoever wrote the homilies, the recognitions, and then cleaned it up in the homilies, as Eisenman would say. Whoever wrote that was on purpose melding two people and naming them something different because they couldn't come out against Paul directly because of how established the Roman Church already was and intermixed with the government. And so if they would have just come out with a polemic against Paul and said, hey, this is Paul and we're going against him, then they would have got retribution. So they couched two characters together, completely lambasted the one, Simon Magus, and then put Pauline arguments in the mouth of him and lambasted those arguments. Does that make sense?
Yes. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just wondered, did you say, does Eisenman have that spelled out in one of his books? Because to talk about that, just my mind just kind of explodes to talk about melding together and somebody's unnamed and you've got some Pauline doctrines in there. I'm a little bit more analytical and does somebody have that kind of, mapped out?
Well, here's what I think. I think your book 1, chapter 70 in there, where it talks about somebody after them and assaulting them on the steps and then getting letters from the high priest and then following them towards Damascus. There's a total disconnect between that person and who's never mentioned again, that enemy, and the whole diatribes about Simon Magus.
I agree. We
know for a fact that Paul did not teach those doctrines and that Simon Magus, a historical character, did in fact teach them. As close as Paul gets to it, probably in the letters that we have, I would say is probably Colossians chapter 2, that could be, without too much difficulty, could be considered dualistic and on the same line as the Gnostics and Simon Magus of that time. But for these that say that they're talking about Paul as Simon Magus, I can't see that unless that was the intention of the original author.
Right.
Get your mind on an enemy, and then another enemy comes along, and you link the two together. But I don't see anything that.
So what is your feeling then on the stoning of Stephen versus the throwing of James off the steps? Or you think that those are two different perspectives of the same historical event?
Personally?
Yes.
I think it could be, because we remember a character, a Christian character at the end of the first century, about the same time this was written, named Stephanos, that was a Hellenistic Jew, was a Nazarene believer, was a slave of Domitian, or at least a valet,
right,
who was upset about the death of Clement and the erasure of his wife Domitia. And when Domitia got back into the scene, it seems that they made a pact to kill Domitian, and Stephanos actually did murder him. And I can see some parallels between this Stephen using that character, because whoever wrote that had the same sources as the regular books of Acts. But I think if that's the case, and they both use the same sources, there's no character, I don't think, in the recognitions that is actually Stephanos. And I don't agree with Eisenman that this is a one-for-one correspondence, yet at the same time, you can't dismiss this, especially when you think about the ousting of Judas and the election of a new apostle there. And even the name of the new apostle kind of feeds into that. So I think for people like us, we need to be able to sit down and get into this a little more in depth to make a decision like that. I went long on this, but this is a very deep subject here.
Absolutely. And to your concern, Marcel, the idea being that, there was a lot of persecution going on. There was a lot of burning of books. There was a lot of all kinds of things like this going on. So the idea that you would want to get a message out but had to code it is not illogical or non-analytical at all. It's actually the opposite. If somebody felt strong enough about a certain subject that would have been harmful to them to say, they would have couched it and put it out there. And then we wouldn't have, it's not like the canon proper where we have, copies of copies, and they're making sure it's all copied right, and they're fixing errors, and they're making it sound good. And then we, have what we have today. You've just got these few manuscripts that, have barely survived. And so then they're automatically more suspect, which doesn't mean they're right or wrong, or doesn't even mean that they mean what we think they mean. But I would certainly say I would agree with Jackson that I don't think we can just dismiss it. I think it plays a part in everything that was going on. Like S.G.F. Brandon says in his book, The Fall of Jerusalem and the Christian Church, the lack of evidence that we have from the first and second centuries of, from 33 AD to 135 AD, the lack of sources we have about what the faith looked like and who was in and who was out and who was teaching correctly and who wasn't is absolutely astounding. And it has to be purposeful, because there's not a lot there, and it's been wiped out by the church and the two sackings of Jerusalem in 70 and 135, 136 AD. So to me, that shouts, I want to figure out what was going on. Like I've said many times, I can't wait to look in the vaults in Rome, the vaults in the Vatican, because there's a lot of source material that they have. I guarantee it that we don't see. And then to even jump on the Eisenman bandwagon, I completely agree with Eisenman that it was not right that every single person who was even allowed to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls for the first how many decades were all Catholic, except for one who was not officially Catholic. All were Catholic. And Eisenman spent his career trying to get these things out to the public. I mean, wow. So that puts him up there in my book. And I don't agree with everything he says either. But the idea that something is trying to be hidden, I don't think is far-fetched at all. And I think that's probably, part of the reason why we're here. But then again, I would assume that some of your concern is that, hey, then what? Then we're just picking and choosing what we want to believe, and we're changing things or whatever. And I think that's a valid concern. But
I'm just a little more concerned with, as far as Paul goes, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so just to clarify what you and Jackson are saying is that whoever wrote the Nazarene Acts, or the first part of it, there might have been an historical character, Simon Magus, but there was also some things going on parallel with Paul and what he was teaching, and that was woven in. So he wasn't necessarily giving an historical account of what was, because it seems like the way it's written, it seems historical to me. But are you saying that so for the sake of just maybe for protecting himself or whomever, he was weaving in other objectionable things that were going on through Paul or even other people? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. First of all, I would say that it's not just strictly a historical account. I mean, have you read the whole work or no?
Yes.
Okay, so if you're looking and seeing the story of Clement, and then finding his mom, and then finding his brothers, and then finding his dad, and that is all that's all there to make a point. And so each of those stories.
You don't think that's real? That's my favorite part.
You know what? The fact that it's your favorite part shows that it was there to emotionally attach you to the book. So that would just be good. That would just be good. I don't want to say penmanship. What is it? Authorship. That would be good storytelling. And so I don't think that's real. No, but I do think that that's couched inside of some real things, i.e., Peter standing up against Simon Magus in Caesarea, and then they're going to follow him to Rome. And so they're weaving this story in between all of that. And to be clear, I don't necessarily think, although I think it's a possibility, that the polemic against the end against the Pauline doctrine is necessarily against Paul himself. If this was written at a later date, it could have been going against what people who followed Paul were using and teaching. So then he's putting in there the words of Paul and showing how this is an error the way that people are using it. So you can divide the two and say, hey, the churches that, followed Paul, they were starting to get into an error of this and that in the author's mind. So he throws that stuff in there to say, hey, this is going to lead you in the wrong way. And it's not necessarily a direct polemic against Paul, but although it could be. So no, I don't think it's completely historical, and I don't think it's void of any historicity. And I don't think it's necessarily against Paul, though it could be, but it certainly is against, at least against Pauline doctrine that was being propagated in the churches of Paul after Paul had passed on. Does that help?
What would you then say were some of the evidential doctrines that are against Paul? If some of his teachings were woven in, what are those that we can find in the Nazarene Acts that we can say, yep, that's Paul, versus the situations where Peter is describing something that Paul describes for himself, right? Like seeing a vision of Yeshua, for instance. Peter describes that as from demons, I believe, if I remember correctly. And we have Paul saying that that's how he
Right.
received this thing as well. Besides those types of things where you can compare what Peter says ought not to be, and Paul saying, hey, that's how I received these things, or this is what I'm doing. What are the doctrinal differences that we can say, here's where Simon Magus is teaching this thing that Paul is also teaching? I think that would be valuable to see it side by side.
Sure, no, absolutely. But I would also argue that you bringing that part up, which I had forgot about, would lend more to the idea that it was a polemic against Paul, rather than just a polemic against doctrines.
You've got to have the doctrines there to back it up. All you're saying is like he's got all this Gnostic teaching, Simon Magus.
No, hold on, wait. So I'm saying because Peter is saying, hey, if you get a revelation this way, it's from a demon, and then Paul gets a revelation that way, anything after that, it doesn't matter if he brings it up in the book or not. That would speak to the author of the recognitions being, anti-Paul completely. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So at that point, might you find some, and should we find some and parallel them? Sure. I don't know that we want to go.
Are there any? Is my question.
Yeah. No, I think there are some. I would have to look though, but I think there are some that go line upon line. And I know this isn't necessarily a Pauline one, but he goes line upon line about a few different doctrines. He talks about the foolishness of the Father begetting himself, and different things like that, which to me lend to a little bit later of an authorship because that probably started happening a little bit later. But so he does, but I'd have to look him up. Like I said, I couldn't go through him now, but I do. Man, I forgot about that, where he says that that's of a devil. If you see
There's a couple of them like that.
Right. So that would lend more to the idea that the author was in fact anti-Pauline, de facto. But I don't know how we got off on all that. But anyway, so yeah, let's do it. Well, why don't we do that then? I mean, for next week, we can be looking some things up in the Nazarene Acts and see if we can see, are there any line upon lines that Kefa says that in there that are direct refutations of Pauline or perceived Pauline doctrine instead of just, generalized statements. I think that's good. But back to the topic at hand is, why is it, do you think, that Paul is used as the litmus test for everyone else, and if there's a perceived disagreement between two people, and Paul is one of those people, that Paul wins out in the minds of modern believers?
Because he has more books in the New Testament.
He has more books, but he doesn't have more words. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and Revelation, which has Yeshua speaking in it, comprise of at least as much text as Paul does. No,
I think it's a little bit more, isn't it, on Paul's side?
Maybe, but it's not like, oh no, we have 37 words from Yeshua and 1,000,000 words from Paul. I mean, Yeshua speaks on a lot of things, and I'm just trying to figure it out, because as a Bible believing Christian, I was going to church and I loved God, and I was defining a lot of things through Paul, and it never even would have, dawned on me that maybe I shouldn't be doing that. But is it legitimate to do, first of all? Do you think because Paul is quote unquote the last one to speak, although he's not, but perceived to be the last one to speak in the New Testament canon era, that he should have the last say and thus preeminence over everything else because of some sort of dispensationalism? Does anyone believe that?
Isn't the Church of Rome guilty of hiding as many other writings and pushing forward Paul and his doctrines?
Yes, although they weren't always that way, because they were a works-oriented religion. And so you had to do certain works, you had to do penance, you had to do this and that. And so it wasn't until the last few hundred years that they've elevated Paul like they have in the way that they have. because he does talk about any works at all. And that's one reason that Luther went so far towards Paul, because he was saying it's not works oriented, but for him, young Luther, it's not the works of the church oriented. Older Luther was not that way. Older Luther embraced James, and older Luther renounced his earlier doctrines that the Lutheran Church still holds, but a lot of people don't know that. So yes, they have. But I mean, this started with Marcion. It started with a guy who was he was the first one to do it. The God of the Old Testament is a bad guy. The God of the New Testament came to do away with the screw-ups of the old guy. And Paul is the true deliverer of the faith. So we're going to use the letters of Paul, which
That's
interesting.
Hellenism. That's old.
What's that now?
That's Hellenism.
Right. But he was taking the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Luke, a truncated version of the Gospel of Luke, and the letter to the Ephesians, he called the letter to the Laodiceans, which is an interesting side note. And he was making, which comes to the point, Jeremy, why are Paul's letters able to be used to back up Hellenism? Right? I mean, well, what is going on in there that if you take away everything else and just are left with that, then you've got Hellenism. You got this dualistic Hellenism. But anyway, I
think Peter answered that in his gospel. Said that the things of Paul were hard to be understood, which the ignorant and unstable wrest to their own destruction as they do the other scriptures.
Yes. So, and interestingly enough, before the disagreement with the church, with the assembly proper and Marcion, anytime when you or at the disagreement, when they all came back together and kicked Marcion out, the letters of Peter, 1 Peter, 1 John, and James, which was still loosely agreed, were put in front of the Pauline letters. So if you were to read the quote-unquote New Testament from front to back, you would encounter 1 Peter before you would encounter any Pauline letters. So then you would read there the warning about how to listen to Paul's words. But nowadays we don't do that. You know, we read Paul's words, and then maybe every once in a while we read the letter from Peter, and it's not as much of a catch-all. But does anybody in here think that we should be interpreting everything in the canon through the paradigm of Paul?
No, not me.
We got 5 chats. Let me check them out.
I think Paul adds a lot to the dimension of the prophetic fulfillment or the future fulfillment.
I also think he adds a lot of useful information just on how to achieve the goals that Yeshua put forth. I think he does an excellent job of doing that. The parts where it seems like antinomian, I think are difficult passages, no matter which way you cut it, whether you think it's pro-Torah or anti-Torah or whatever. It's difficult to understand what he's saying.
Sure, which I think is why the 2 Peter wording there and what he said. So then what is the? So then let me ask you this: how different would your belief, and I say that in the capital B, your faith, capital F, look if you had never read any of the letters of Paul?
I'm not sure mine would be much different.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
No.
Because
Well,
I think
keeping Torah, that's for sure.
yeah, Yeah, I mean, I think that if Paul wasn't in there, I think that it does affect all of us here. Because we were just, I mean, if you came up in a Christian Protestant church at all, it was just Paul, Paul, Paul. Even if it was a church that also preached, you know, good works and this and that and the other, the paradigms, like you said, and I Jeremy, like he gives certain things ways to think. Like there are certain things that that immediately when something happens, oh, this is what the Bible said to do. Where does it come from? It comes from Paul. I was speaking with someone the other day who is very antinomian, and everything they quoted was from Paul. There wasn't anything they quoted until I made them read the Gospels that was from Yeshua. So even though when we look at this group and we look at us and see, hey, we are a lot less Pauline than they are in the way we do things, we're still very Pauline, even if we don't realize it, because it's just been ground into us, in my opinion.
Like, what's an example of that?
Well, for instance, like if I said to you, hey, what are the works of the flesh and what are the works of the spirit? You're going to quote Paul. If I said to you, hey, how should you adorn yourself in the spirit? You're going to quote the armor of God. When I say everything is Pauline. And it doesn't mean that that's wrong or bad. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying we have a paradigm of Paulinism.
Do you have any better ones than those? Because I don't necessarily relate to those. Like I've never been raised in a place where we adorned ourselves with the armor of God or anything. I wasn't raised that way. I know my wife was, for instance. That's like a norm for them to do every night, before bed. But the ones that you mentioned to me don't resonate. Do you have any other ones?
Right. No, I don't. Well, I mean, you would have to tell me, how were you raised and what was your church teaching? And then you'll come up with the ones that were Pauline, or maybe they weren't. Maybe your church wasn't Pauline. I don't know.
I'm sure they were, but I mean, I'm just trying to get to a Pauline doctrine that is, some of those things are just kind of like encouragements, and that, you explain to your kids, certain things, and you use different ways of doing that. And here's Paul, kind of doing the same thing. And yeah, it's helpful. But what's a doctrinal position that, we can point to that says, like, you cannot find this, for instance, in anywhere else? And I don't want to get to the cliche one of like anti-Torah, right? But
well, I mean,
any other
specifically, well, there's a lot of things that Paul says that you can't find anywhere else.
Surely he's just paraphrasing scripture, the Old Testament. And I believe that, for instance, for me, my paradigm has changed dramatically over the years. Sure. Learned, and I no longer I do read Paul and I understand Paul, but my paradigm, my understanding, my faith is now not in faith itself, because the law is good, and I've learned that before I started understanding about the law, and that the law was not done away with. Yes, we followed Paul, and the law was done away with, but I don't know. I understand now. I see the Old Testament, the writings, and I follow that, and I say, wow, there's nothing wrong with that.
Sure. So then, okay, no, that's good. And like I said, we're going to be way less Pauline than somebody in the church proper. Barbara here says, Barbara Ray, grace as opposed to Yahweh's mercy that always existed is an example. I guess for Jeremy, can you expound on that, Barbara? Do you have a microphone?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not a lot to expound on, really, I don't think. I think it's just kind of evident, because I never, I came up out of, as a youngster, I came out of Catholicism, walked away at 12 because at my first communion done for my mother, they told me I had to tell every sin I had to the priest, and I just wrestled on that and said, basically, hell no. If I'm going to go to hell, I'm going to go to hell, but I've been talking to him my whole life directly, and there's no man I'm going to tell this stuff to. I was very upset with that. So, for me, I was kind of a little ornery rebel, but at the same time, as I grew up, in the crazy world and had my days of nuts and moved on and sought Yahweh when I got, a grown up, all there was the church. And every time something felt wrong to me, this is just my experience. I'm not saying, I know everything. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when every time something felt wrong to me, I would go look and it would be something about, from the book of Paul. And I'm like, well, it went tilt with everything else that was in my spirit that I always knew about him. It just, everybody, and I was in Southern California, by the way. And amongst all the early Dwight Thompsons and Gardner Ted Armstrongs and all these people that were just destroying little churches everywhere, including ours. And bringing in all these money-hungry, slain in the spirit kind of crazy stuff. It was just absolutely going wild. And just with that, everything was, I just kept going, why is everything on what Paul said? And I realized that even then, even though I didn't know a lot, I kept realizing that that's what was happening. As I've gotten plenty old now, I can look back and I can say, I don't see a lot of difference. It seems to me even more, the more I go, why is everything on Paul? So I'd look and then I start seeing, he says, I, me. It's like he's like talking for himself constantly. But then, and I have personal experience of decades of clinical narcissism near me and over me. And I can tell you, the reflection is so similar. It's like there's just, everything's from his perspective. Even when he says, and you brought it up earlier, I believe, about, or maybe someone else did last night to me, but about, any other doctrine. It's like, whose doctrine? Because like he's like talking about stuff Yeshua never talked about, i.e. the grace and so forth. And so for me, it's kind of it's just always gone back. Sorry, I'm not a good speaker like the rest.
No, that's all right.
I just talk emotionally. I'm a woman.
So so then can you just quickly break down then the idea of Paul's grace versus Yahweh's mercy?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see those things as different?
I see them as a pagan, the three graces. I see them as the whole, I've looked at all this stuff and I go, this fits completely in that. It's as if someone's going, oh, I can take this beauty, this literature, this whatever, right? This happens every day in entertainment and so forth. And even in the churches, this is what I said I saw all the time. They would take something, you hear them all the time. Like I've heard sermons, I can't even tell you, in churches. For all these years, I go to a church, everybody says it's a wonderful church. You go to this church, this is before I knew, the Torah. And you would hear them preach on, being in December, the real meaning of the Christmas tree. I mean, come on. I mean, you can make anything. You can, I heard someone once say to me that you can prove any doctrine with the Bible. You can prove it. What's really interesting is try to take a doctrine and disprove it. Because if you can disprove it or it doesn't hold water, then get rid of it. And, put that on the side, at least go, that's not where I'm putting my direction. That's a side note. And if it fits later, I find that it fits, I'll pull it back in. But until then, it's not working in here with the rest. Sure. And Paul just is in that category to me.
Okay, so can you mute for a second?
Yes.
What you're saying then, if I've got you correct, if I'm understanding you correctly, and I've heard this argument, is that two things. Paul is taking something Hebraic and putting it in a Hellenistic mindset. I would say partially that's going to happen because of linguistics. So for instance, you're saying that the word grace comes from the three graces, which are pagan deities basically, which it does, the three gracias. And so then it gets couched kind of in that Hellenistic mindset. So are you saying that I guess it doesn't matter. He either did it purposely, which would make sense if he was trying to reach the Gentile world. But for better or for worse, for right or wrong, it gets away from the favor of Yahweh from the Hebraic standpoint. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, kind of what I'm saying. Exactly, kind of mesh that together with his, push on, the confusing words about the law and about, the works
Sure.
and so forth. And then just, my big thing is that I think I made a message about it earlier. People forget that this was a guy. He's like a guy, a very fallible guy. He's a human being. He's a man, not a god. And that's what I see people treat him like. And I'm like, whoa, that really bothers me. It really disturbs me that they put him on such a pedestal.
And I think we do that with all of our heroes. I think that, whether it be George Washington or, anybody that we can't have access to, certainly over time becomes more and more of a legend, more and more of a hero. And then you've got this guy who, to at least half of the church, before half of the assemblies, was elevated above everybody else. So then his legend grows and grows and grows to where you get people that do deify him in a sense. I agree.
Well, and then you have, all through time, we have false history. I mean, what do we dig for this stuff for? So we can find out the facts that have been all mangled and covered up, right?
Right.
Like we're trying to piece together the truth out of all these sources. And that's pretty much the only way you got to research, the only way you're going to come to it, because you can't take it on face value. And unfortunately, I think that's what we kind of mostly all of us got brought up through, was that, not to do that, just to, you speak out of favor with Paul, and I've been thrown out of groups. I've been thrown out of churches. It's just like crazy. And I'm like, I'm asking questions. I'm asking for an answer.
Sure.
If this, why that? And, you're the enemy. So it's really weird, but that's been my experience.
Okay. Anyone want to step up now and defend the doctrine of Pauline grace? And say that it's not what Barbara is saying that it is?
You can have all kinds of places in the Tanakh where it talks about grace, so grace is there too.
Okay. I mean, I'm probably halfway in the middle of that. I agree. Linguistics is something that I enjoy. And the word gracia is different from the word that's probably translated grace, but means favor in Hebrew, and they have different connotations and different meanings. So, a lot of people don't understand that the earliest extant manuscripts that we have of even the Pauline letters, which are the earliest that we have, when important words come around, words that cannot be defined in another language, that there are put what they call nomina sacra, or I call them divine placeholders. And so it's like for the name of Yahweh, for the name of Yeshua, for saying the master, for saying the Ruach HaKodesh. They don't put those into Greek. They put capital Greek letters with circles around them sometimes to denote you need to go back to the Hebrew and look up what this word means, which is interesting. And a lot of people don't know that they did that. And so I don't think they did it with the word grace, but I can't be sure. I'll have to go back and check. Because I think if they did do it with the word grace, that would be an interesting case that the two words, the Hebrew word and the Hebrew word and the Greek word don't mean the same thing. But yes, mercy, favor, is found in the covenant scriptures from Genesis to Malachi, and it's not some new concept. Of course not. Sometimes I ask people the question, do you want to serve that old mean father Elohim in the Old Testament who spared David's life when he committed murder and adultery, or do you want to serve the loving, merciful Yeshua in the New Testament who smote Ananias and Sapphira as they stood there in front of the Apostle Peter? So you've got both aspects of the Father, loving and justice, played out from Genesis to Revelation, in my opinion, throughout.
Can I make a little notation on that? I understand and I agree what you're saying about the placeholder words when it's not in the language. I lived in Asia and I saw them do that, like the word glass, because they didn't have the word glass. They'd say English glass. They get that. But I also have seen a lot in researching history and so forth, and false history as written. Basically, narratives that are being driven now. And what I see is words of deception, if that makes sense. They're words, let's just say in witchcraft, okay? In witchcraft, it's noted that words mean one thing to us, but it means another to the inner circle, to the witches, to know what that language, they're talking to each other in a code. This is in rock music, this is in all kinds of stuff. So I have the concern about that, on that level as well. That,
Barbara,
who knows?
To be certain, we are not going to backwards mask 1 Corinthians, okay? So.
Let's don't.
Okay, Professor Smith put up some scriptures about Cain in the Hebrew. I do bend a little closer to Barbara in the sense that I never translate that as grace because of where grace comes from, the word comes from, but I do translate it as favor, and that's what it means. But he's just, throwing some up there to show you that the concept is there. And anyone else to speak on the topic? It's we're about at an hour. Anybody else want to defend Paul or try to slay him?
Just a quick reminder that Jackson sent us an email in Facebook. Eisenman is coming up with his new book soon, Breaking the Dead Sea Scrolls Monopoly. Really looking forward to it.
Oh, yeah.
There's a new interpretation of the Messianic movement in Palestine. So, Jackson, you must keep us informed when that's been released, please, because I'd like to get that.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it, too. And I'm kind of wondering why he waited so long to make this account, except for he said he was an unnamed co-author in the Dead Sea Scrolls Deception,
right,
which pretty much goes through this, but as a first-person review of this particular event that I followed very closely back 10, 20, 30 years ago, I think maybe he was waiting for some people to pass away.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, you think? Lizette says, for me, Saul makes much more sense now since I got over my own prejudiced view of my Yehudim brethren. He had the training of Hillel, who is very well known to side on the side of Chesed, mercy, loving kindness, than Shammai, who often ruled on the side of Geburah, judgment. So I would just harken back to my original, this is what I tell people. I tell people that Yeshua's words are primary. And so if I want to dig in, and Moses's words are secondary, and then everybody else follows that. So if I want to dig into something, that's fine. If I want to speculate on, has the rapture happened, or is it ever going to happen, or did the judgment happen in the first century? Is it going to happen later? Or what does the wheel within a wheel mean from Ezekiel? Or what is Paul trying to say when he says that Well, I won't go into it because I'll open a can of worms. But whatever, I always go back to Yeshua and Moshe. Those two are the two that everything else has to be interpreted through. And even Moshe has to be interpreted through Yeshua. Obviously, he couldn't be until Yeshua came on the earth. But now that we have had Yeshua, he can be interpreted through that. So it's not a problem to me for Paul to write about something that I'm not just going to go with what I think Paul is saying if it goes against what Yeshua and Moshe already said. That's just the way that you have to divide it. And if you are spending too much time on Paul or Peter or whoever, and you're not spending time with Yeshua and Moshe, then I think that could be not good. Even the world leaders use Hebrew code to communicate. I don't know what that means. What world leaders are using Hebrew code, Anne?
All of them, and it's a private language because most people don't know what they're doing. So because the Hebrew letters, like as you know, they all have many meanings. Each letter has many meanings. So most people don't understand what they're doing. So when they speak, they all understand each other, but the normal person doesn't. But if you know Hebrew, you understand it. And they're coming from the dark side, but they're using Hebrew because it's the most powerful language.
Interesting. You going to send me on a YouTube rabbit hole, or?
No, you won't find anything like that on YouTube.
Oh, darn it. All right. Go ahead.
I can talk to you and give you a short teaching on from a guy who revealed it.
Okay, sounds good. Anyone else? Anybody got anything else to throw in on this subject? Okay, so our assignment for this week then is to scour the Nazarene Acts. That's available. That's on the Yahad. You can get that off of the Yahad think tank, right? On Facebook, there's documents. I think Nazarene Acts is one of them that's there. Scour that to see if there are any purely Pauline doctrines that the author puts in Kepha's mouth or anybody else's mouth that are refuted by Peter or anybody else, and see if we can see line for line if there actually is something doctrinally that is against possibly against Paul, and not just the possible being the enemy that throws James down. All right, is that it?
Great meeting.
Can we continue next week to talk about how our faith would be different without Paul's letters along with Nazarene Acts? Absolutely. Absolutely we can. And yeah, whatever you can bring to the table next week, look it up, go through, maybe even read a few of Paul's letters, the ones that you would normally read, and see if, oh yeah, man, I live my life by that. I don't see that said anywhere else, but I live my life by that. Or, oh yeah, the church taught me this, and man, I hold that to be true. Whether now you think you were wishing you didn't, or whether whether you think it's just fine and completely proper and in line with Torah. All right? All right, be blessed.
Thank
Shabbat
you.
shalom.
Amen.